Number 1, the person who fell into their own trap pit. Natural pitfall traps, collapsed caves, and sinkholes also accumulated bones. Animals and hominins fell in while chasing prey or investigating carcasses at the bottom. The surface above these natural traps is often flat. Something running at speed goes in without warning. Nothing that fell in got out. The walls could not be scaled. In the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, inside an elaborate network of karst caves called the Hoyo Negro system, researchers found the remains of a girl they named Naira. She dates to roughly 12 to 13,000 years ago. She fell more than 100 feet to her death, nearly half a mile inside the cave system. At the end of the Pleistocene, these passages were largely dry. Researchers speculate she was looking for water, possibly a small puddle at the bottom. Nobody could retrieve her. Analysis of her pelvis showed pitting consistent with having already given birth. She was a teenager. A teenage mother who survived childbirth but not a hole in the ground. Her leg bones showed lines of halted growth suggesting frequent malnutrition or parasite infestation. Her teeth confirmed nutrition was rather limited quite often. A fractured pelvis indicates she struck something hard during the fall. Violent impact, not a gentle slide. Pit traps used for hunting date back at least 10,000 years. The same technology that kept humans fed could kill the builders. These pits were deliberately concealed. You had to specifically forget where you put your own lethal trap. Ethnographic accounts confirm hunters in various traditions occasionally fell into their own pits, especially when hunting at night, especially after seasonal terrain shifts changed the landmarks. The mainstream theory is straightforward. Naya fell accidentally while foraging for water in a drought environment. Some archaeologists take a broader view. Natural pitfall accumulations suggest systematic risk. Hominins regularly investigated the smell of carcasses at pit bottoms and fell in themselves. A more speculative reading looks at those stone engravings with their exaggerated death pits. Could ritual significance of trap sites have drawn people dangerously close to their own constructions? The evidence allows multiple interpretations. What it does not allow is the assumption that falling into a pit was rare. It was routine enough to leave a recurring signature in the archaeological record. And if falling into holes was deadly, what happened when humans started deliberately cutting holes into each other? Number 2. The Neolithic skull with a trepanation gone wrong. Trepanation means drilling or scraping a hole in the skull. It dates back 7,000 to 10,000 years. It may be the oldest surgical procedure with archaeological evidence. At one burial site in France, dated to roughly 6500 BCE, 40 out of 120 prehistoric skulls had trepanation holes. Only about 40% of patients survived at that time. Over 1,500 trephine skulls from the Neolithic period have been uncovered worldwide. That represents 5 to 10% of all cranial remains from the era. They appear across Europe, Siberia, China, and the Americas. The earliest unequivocal evidence comes from a 7,000-year-old burial at Ensisheim in Alsace, France. Bone was extracted using flint or metal blades. Surgeons drilled small holes, made intersecting incisions, or scraped through the cranial vault. Dr. Plinio Prioreschi proposed a striking hypothesis. Neolithic surgeons performed trepanation to revive people they believed were dead, drilling into skulls to bring people back to life. The observational logic makes a dark kind of sense. Massive blunt head injuries were invariably lethal, but mild blows knocked someone down briefly before they recovered on their own. The surgery attempted to replicate that recovery. Incomplete trepanations found on many skulls were explained not by death during surgery, but by patients waking up and interrupting the procedure. Becoming undead mid-operation. Survival rates improved dramatically over millennia. Iron Age populations achieved 78% success rates. Neolithic rates were significantly lower. In 2018, researchers published evidence of a cow trepanned at Champ-Durand in France dating between 3,400 and 3,000 BCE practice on domestic animals before operating on humans. The tools included flint scrapers, obsidian blades, and sharpened stones, none of which would pass a modern hygiene inspection. Operations were most often performed on the left side of the skull. Traumatic lesions were generally dealt by right-handed adversaries striking the left. Failed trepanations show catastrophic radiating fractures. The surgeon applied too much force and shattered the skull like pottery. Simulated experiments show trepanation could be conducted with a V-bladed stone tool, Though the thin occipital bone's thickness made penetration difficult without causing visible damage, most trephine crania belong to adult males. But women and children are also represented. Children underwent Stone Age brain surgery. The removed bone disc, called the rondelle, was sometimes kept and worn as an amulet. Your failed surgery became someone else's good luck charm. Evidence of infection in failed cases shows sepsis was the leading secondary killer. Peru has more trepanned crania than anywhere on Earth. Frequent co-occurrence with skull fractures suggests emergency trauma medicine that sometimes made things much worse. The procedure persisted for over 8,000 years across nearly every continent. The most enduring bad medical idea in human history, or possibly the most enduring good one, depending on which 40% you belong to. The mainstream theory holds that trepanation was emergency trauma surgery to relieve pressure from cerebral edema and hemorrhage after skull fractures. Pyrenees' revival hypothesis offers another framework. The surgery was an attempt to wake the dead, with incomplete procedures explained by patients regaining consciousness mid-operation. A more speculative interpretation suggests trepanation served primarily spiritual purposes, allowing evil spirits to exit the brain. The medical applications were secondary discoveries, 8,000 years of cutting holes in heads. And somehow the kill rate was considered acceptable. But trepanation required restraint, a controlled hand. What happened when the threat was not careful surgery, but uncontrollable appetite? Number 3, the hunter who ate himself to death. Indigenous communities feasted on huge decomposing beasts, hippos trapped in pits, beached whales. Hunters smeared themselves with animal fat before gorging on greasy innards. After slicing open animal midsections, both adults and children climbed into massive, rotting body cavities to remove meat and fat. The human stomach holds roughly 1 to 1.5 liters comfortably. It can stretch to 4 liters under extreme gorging. Beyond that, gastric rupture becomes a genuine risk. Archaeological feast sites show massive quantities of animal remains processed in single events. Entire herds of bison or mammoth. Extreme binge consumption was culturally patterned. Past and present, indigenous peoples most wanted the fatty body parts: tongue, fat deposits, brisket, ribs, intestinal fatty tissue, organs, marrow, not the lean cuts modern paleo diets emphasize. Rapid consumption of high-fat organ meats and marrow can trigger acute pancreatitis, fatal even with modern medical intervention. The thrifty genotype hypothesis proposes that human metabolism evolved to store energy aggressively during abundance. Overeating after a kill was almost involuntary. Refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal metabolic disturbance from eating large quantities after prolonged starvation, was a real danger between kills. Coprolites at multiple Paleolithic sites show undigested meat fiber. Individuals consumed far more than their digestive systems could process. Taphonomic analysis at some kill sites shows human remains intermingled with animal remains at the same butchering location. Death occurred during or immediately after the feast. A single adult bison provides roughly 3.5 million calories. Always far more food than any individual could safely eat. Native Americans in Missouri made prize soup from greenish, decaying bison flesh. The animals were buried whole in winter and unearthed in spring after ripening for peak tastiness. Putrefied meat compounds the risk: botulism, clostridium, and salmonella. Toxins from rotting meat could kill within hours of a large meal. Gastric volvulus, stomach twisting, is another risk of extreme gorging. Invariably fatal without surgical intervention. Ethno-historical accounts from multiple cultures describe feast deaths, individuals who died from overconsumption at communal hunts, a recognized hazard, not a surprise, not unusual, just the cost of dinner. The mainstream theory treats feast or famine cycles as biologically incentivized by evolution. Gorging was adaptive behavior that occasionally killed through pancreatitis, refeeding syndrome, or gastric rupture. Some researchers argue that human remains at butchering sites represent ritual deposition rather than accidental death. The speculative extension pushes further. The thrifty genotype made overeating essentially involuntary. Prehistoric humans were metabolically incapable of stopping. Feast death was less about greed and more about biology overriding cognition. You survived the hunt, you survived the butchering, you did not survive the meal, and at least you died outdoors. The next group died underground, in the dark, doing something no survival manual would ever recommend. Number 4. The cave painter who got stuck. Researchers reconstructed how Magdalenian people navigated the Exeberry cave system in the Western Pyrenees 16,000 years ago. It's described as one of the most extreme examples of prehistoric caving. To reach the deepest art, prehistoric artists faced underground lakes, tight crawlways opening into 2-meter drops, a 16-meter sinkhole surrounded by a perilous ledge where horses were engraved. They broke stalagmites with flint tools, chimneyed down vertical drops, crawled through tight passages, edged along exposed ledges, all for the purpose of making art. They used torches of juniper, pine, and bone to navigate total darkness. Oxygen depletion from torches and respiration in confined spaces could render a person unconscious. At Cosquer Cave near Marseille, the entrance tunnel is now more than 120 feet underwater and longer than a football field. When artists entered 27,000 years ago, they walked from flat grassy plains through dry passages. The Grotte de Cussac in Dordogne contains remains of 6 human bodies inside bare hibernation chambers deep within the cave. They date between 26,000 and 35,000 years ago. Cussac was a sanctuary, not a dwelling. People entered for ritual purposes, possibly initiation ceremonies described as a rite of passage for adolescents. The cave is accessed through a narrow passage through boulders, exactly the kind of constriction that could permanently trap a person. Les Combarelles cave contains exquisitely engraved depictions along a narrow passage of roughly 240 meters. Spaces so tight modern visitors struggle to pass through. Cave squeeze, becoming wedged in a narrowing passage, is well documented in modern speleology, equally deadly 20,000 years ago without rescue equipment. At Lascaux, the famous shaft scene sits at the bottom of a 5-meter vertical drop requiring deliberate descent into a space extremely difficult to exit. The cave was entered through a 15-meter deep shaft the discoverers had to squeeze through. Hypothermia in deep caves, temperatures around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius year-round, would kill an immobilized person within hours, especially with an extinguished torch. Some art is in passages so narrow the artist had to lie flat and work with extended arms. Getting stuck in that position means death by compression asphyxia. Carbon dioxide accumulation from burning torches in poorly ventilated passages is a lethal hazard even modern cavers respect. Modern caving fatalities from entrapment in narrow passages remain regular even with professional equipment, headlamps, and rescue teams. The mainstream theory holds that cave art served ritual or spiritual purposes significant enough to justify extreme physical risk. Deaths were accepted costs of ceremonial practice. Some archaeologists note that the Cussac bodies in bare hibernation chambers suggest deliberate deposition of the dead in sacred spaces. Some individuals found stuck may have been placed there intentionally after death. A speculative reading suggests initiation rites for adolescents involve navigating dangerous cave passages as proof of worthiness. Deaths during these rites may have been seen as spiritually meaningful rather than accidental. They died in the dark for a picture of a horse, but dying underground at least left you hidden. The next death happened in broad daylight under the largest stone ever erected by human hands. Number 5. The person crushed by a falling menhir. An estimated 50,000 megaliths once stood in northern Europe. Nearly 10,000 remain today. Many toppled during or shortly after erection. The Grand Menhir of Ergra at Lochmardiacher in Brittany, erected around 4700 BCE, measured 20.6 meters and weighed approximately 330 tons. The largest stone ever moved and erected by Neolithic people. For modern reference, that is roughly the weight of a fully loaded Boeing 737. The stone broke around 4000 BCE, roughly 700 years after erection. Some archaeologists favor an earthquake supported by computer modeling, but debate persists. The Grand Menhir either broke on erection, fell in an earthquake, or was deliberately toppled. Construction failure is taken seriously as a possibility. European megaliths were constructed during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, roughly 4500 to 1500 BCE, 3,000 years of moving impossibly heavy stones. At Carnac in Brittany, more than 3,000 prehistoric standing stones hewn from local granite form the largest such collection in the world. Fewer than 700 of those original 3,000 were still standing by the 1860s. Toppling was extremely common. Neolithic farmers erected roughly 35,000 megaliths across Europe between 5500 and 3000 BCE. Stones of 5 to 50 tons were standard in dolmen and passage grave construction, and he could crush a worker instantly if ropes or ramps failed. The logistics of erecting a 330-ton stone with ropes, rollers, ramps, and manpower meant catastrophic failure during the final lift was a constant danger. Experimental archaeology replicating megalith erection has documented near accidents and extreme difficulty controlling multi-ton stones during the final tipping moment. Some toppled menhirs were reused in tomb and dolmen construction. The stones that killed became building material for burial chambers. Burial evidence from megalithic construction sites occasionally shows hastily interred individuals adjacent to monuments, consistent with construction fatalities. Modern occupational safety data for quarrying and heavy construction confirms crushing injuries remain among the deadliest workplace hazards. These people had no hard hats. The mainstream theory treats megalith erection as a controlled engineering process with the known risks. Deaths were construction accidents during an inherently dangerous operation. Some archaeologists argue that toppled menhirs may have been deliberately felled as part of monument decommissioning rituals. Not all collapses were accidental. The speculative angle asks whether the Grand Menhir may have broken during erection itself rather than 700 years later. The earthquake hypothesis conveniently absolves the builders of engineering failure. Stones that weigh 330 tons are terrifying enough standing still. But what about a house that weighs nothing individually, yet collapses all at once? The next structure was built from the bones of the largest animals that ever walked the earth. Number 6. The Mammoth bone hut collapse victim. In 1965, a Ukrainian farmer dug up a mammoth jawbone while expanding his cellar. Further excavation revealed 4 huts built from 149 mammoth bones, dating roughly 15,000 years ago. The Menhir site in central Ukraine contains 4 mammoth bone structures, ranging from 12 to 24 square meters. New analysis indicates at least one structure was used for up to 429 years. Long-term dwelling, not temporary shelter. The site dates to the Epigravettian culture, estimated 18,200 to 17,400 years old, a winter settlement of Paleolithic hunters on the frozen steppe. These huts were composed of several hundred bones and tusks arranged in rough circles, 6 to 10 meters in diameter, hearths near center, tools scattered within. Large mammoth bones weigh hundreds of pounds even dry. The structures were presumably covered with animal skins for protection against cold and wind. These are perhaps the earliest examples of domed architecture, mandibles as foundation walls, interlocked tusks as roof supports. Inside one hut, researchers found amber ornaments, fossil shells, and a drum made from a mammoth skull painted with red ochre dots. One of the oldest percussion instruments ever discovered. A schematic map carved on mammoth tusk was also found at Menhir, the oldest map ever found in Ukraine. Materials like amber and shells found inside were transported 350 to 500 kilometers, evidence of long-distance trade networks among Ice Age tundra dwellers. Wood was scarce on the tundra. That forced resourceful use of mammoth remains as primary building material, but bones were likely gathered from natural accumulations rather than fresh kills, already weathered and potentially weakened before construction. The structural analysis is straightforward. Interlocking bone architecture was inherently unstable compared to timber or stone. Settling, wind, and frost heave could all trigger collapse. A mammoth skull weighing up to 200 kilograms falling from a roof position delivers lethal force equivalent to a modern construction accident. A single mammoth tusk weighs 40 to 80 kilograms as an arched roof support. If one shifted, cascading collapse of interlocking bones would be instantaneous. Collapsed structures documented at multiple Ukrainian and Russian sites confirm structural failure was not rare. The mainstream theory treats these dwellings as ingenious adaptations to treeless tundra. Collapses were structural failures from material degradation over centuries of use. Some researchers suggest collapses may have been deliberate demolitions, decommissioning structures as part of seasonal migration or ritual closure. The speculative view connects the 429-year use span to continuous repair and rebuilding. Catastrophic collapse may indicate an abandonment event, climate shift, or population decline, rather than sudden failure. Mammoth bones falling on you is dramatic, but the next death is almost comically disproportionate. because the weapon involved was designed for something that weighs about 2 kilograms. Number 7. The person killed by a rabbit hunt gone wrong. Perimortem skull fractures, embedded projectile points in ribs. It's in. Perifractures on forearms. Sharp force neck cuts. These are the classic skeletal signatures of interpersonal violence. Microliths, tiny flint points less than 3 centimeters, were standard ammunition for hunting small game during the Mesolithic, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 BCE. Rabbits, hares, birds. These microliths have been found embedded in human bone at multiple European Mesolithic sites. People struck by weapons designed for rabbits. Research on 4 Mesolithic Danube sites, Lepenski Vir, Vlasak, Padina, and Hajdučka Vodenici, examined 418 individuals. Violent interactions were few. Sporadic episodes. Friendly fire during communal hunts is well documented ethnographically, groups driving game toward kill zones. Equally likely in prehistory, small flint points designed for rabbit skin could easily pierce human skin and lodge in bone when propelled by bow or spear thrower. A Mesolithic female from Mezzocorona Borgo Nuovo in the Italian Alps showed perimortem frontal bone perforation and healed cranial and forearm fractures. Violence directed at women too. The distinction between hunting accident and deliberate attack is often impossible from skeletal evidence. Was it friendly fire or genuine rage over a rabbit? Mesolithic recurve bows with 30 to 60 pound draw weight could deliver lethal microlith wounds at ranges under 30 meters. Communal to rabbit drives involve dozens of hunters converging on a small area. Ideal accidental strike conditions. The caloric return on a single rabbit is roughly 500 calories. The caloric cost of a fatal hunting wound is possibly the worst energy investment ratio in human subsistence history. Microliths were composite weapons, multiple tiny points mounted on a single arrow shaft. One rabbit arrow could inflict multiple wound tracks in a human. Maximum lethal range of a Mesolithic bow was roughly 40 to 60 meters, close enough to clearly see what you hit. Flesh wounds from the same weapons leave no skeletal trace. The documented embedded points are literally described as the tip of the iceberg. At Jebel Sahaba, a late Pleistocene Nile cemetery, reanalysis of 61 individuals documented healed and unhealed injuries from arrows and clubs across multiple episodes. The mainstream theory reads embedded microliths in human bone as friendly fire accidents during communal small game hunts. Converging hunters fired into the same kill zone. Some archaeologists push back. The embedded points may represent deliberate interpersonal violence. The hunting accident interpretation conveniently softens evidence for endemic conflict. The speculative angle raises an unsettling possibility. Communal hunts may have served as socially sanctioned opportunities for settling disputes under cover of accidental strikes. Plausible deniability built into the event. 500 calories a rabbit, 1 dead hunter. The math does not work, but the next entry involves an animal large enough to make the math terrifying in the opposite direction. Number 8, the Neanderthal stomped by a horse. Neanderthals are depicted as leading dangerous lives. High trauma attributed to violent behavior, mobile lifestyles, carnivore attacks, or close-range hunting of large prey. In 1995, Berger and Trinkos published a landmark finding. Neanderthal trauma distributions closely matched North American rodeo performers, predominantly head, neck, and upper body injuries. Few lower limb traumas. The parallel was vivid. Just as rodeo cowboys get too close to angry animals, Neanderthals' hunting style, sneaking up and jabbing with heavy thrusting spears, brought them within striking distance of hoofed prey. The original conclusion described frequent close encounters with large ungulates, unkindly disposed to the humans involved. A 2018 study published in Nature reassessed the hypothesis. Neanderthals and upper Paleolithic modern humans exhibited similar overall incidences of cranial trauma. Trinkos offered alternative explanations. Early modern humans who hurled projectiles from a safe distance had the same injury patterns. That undermined the close-range hunting explanation. Every known fairly complete Neanderthal skeleton over age 25 has at least one healed broken bone. Serious injury was essentially universal in adult life. About 30% of Neanderthal trauma was concentrated on face and head. Later research showed this rate was lower than many modern activities. A 2017 reassessment found Neanderthal injury patterns also statistically matched water tubing and golf cart accidents, considerably less heroic than rodeo riding. Wild horses in Pleistocene Europe weighed 300 to 500 kilograms. They could deliver kick forces exceeding 10,000 newtons, enough to shatter a rib cage or crush a skull. That is comparable to being hit by a small car at moderate speed. Horses were a major prey species. Horse bones dominate faunal assemblages at many Middle Paleolithic sites. These close encounters were routine dinner preparation. No sex differences in Neanderthal trauma location patterns have been identified. Male and female Neanderthals engaged in similar trauma-inducing activities. The Shanidar 1 Neanderthal had injuries causing possible blindness, arthritic feet, and a missing right forearm, yet survived years afterward, indicating group care for catastrophically injured individuals. Neanderthal brain size averaged roughly 1,400 cubic centimeters, larger than modern humans. Did not prevent them from repeatedly getting too close to things that kick. The mainstream theory holds that Neanderthal trauma reflects the hazards of close-range hunting with thrusting spears. The rodeo comparison, while imperfect, captures the essential biomechanics. The 2018 reassessment suggests injury patterns reflect general Paleolithic lifestyle dangers shared by all humans, not Neanderthal-specific hunting methods. Interpersonal violence may be equally responsible. The speculative interpretation points to the golf cart and water tubing match. It suggests trauma comparisons are methodologically unreliable. Neanderthal injuries may reflect unknown behaviors entirely unrelated to hunting, rough play, transit accidents, shelter collapses. Close-range hunting of horses, bison, and aurochs continued for over 200,000 years. Neanderthals knew the danger and did it anyway. Every generation. Getting kicked by a horse is at least understandable. The next death is harder to explain, because the water was barely knee-deep. Number 9. The person who drowned in a shallow ritual pool. Neolithic ritual sites across Europe frequently feature constructed water features. Artificial pools, ditches, waterlogged enclosures, used for ceremonial purposes. Human remains in shallow water contexts at ritual sites suggest drowning in ceremonial pools was a documented phenomenon. These constructed Neolithic ritual pools range from half a meter to 1.5 meters deep, barely enough to submerge a standing adult. More than enough to drown an incapacitated one. Intoxication from fermented beverages dramatically increases drowning risk in shallow water. Evidence of fermented drinks dates to at least 7,000 BCE in China and the Near East. Ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, documented in Neolithic agricultural communities, causes seizures, hallucinations, and loss of motor control. Drowning risk in ankle-deep water. Archaeological evidence of beer and mead production at Neolithic sites across northern Europe suggests ritual intoxication was common at ceremonial gatherings. The medical reality is blunt. Approximately 10% of modern drownings occur in water less than 1 meter deep, typically involving alcohol, seizure, or loss of consciousness. Neolithic causewayed enclosures, ritual sites with segmented ditches, frequently contained waterlogged deposits with human remains. Dry drowning, laryngospasm triggered by sudden face immersion in cold water, can cause death in as little as 15 centimeters of water. It leaves no skeletal evidence. The mammalian diving reflex triggered by cold facial water contact can cause cardiac arrhythmia in susceptible individuals. Another shallow water death mechanism. Cold shock response from sudden immersion causes gasping and involuntary water inhalation within 30 seconds, even in water shallow enough to stand in. Epilepsy, affecting roughly 1% of all populations regardless of era, makes anyone near water vulnerable. A seizure in a shallow pool is as lethal as in the ocean. Ritual bathing and immersion are documented in Neolithic and Bronze Age ceremonial practices across Europe, the Near East, and South Asia. Archaeological invisibility of drowning, no skeletal trauma markers, means documented cases are a fraction of actual occurrences. Modern forensic data records roughly 4,000 annual drownings in the United States. About 25% occur in non-pool shallow water situations. The ritual pool death is a living statistical category. The mainstream theory links these drownings to a combination of intoxication and incapacitation near water during ceremonial events. Alcohol, ergot, seizure. Some archaeologists argue that human remains in watery ritual contexts may represent deliberate votive deposition or sacrifice rather than accidental drowning. The embarrassing death reading imposes modern assumptions. The speculative extension proposes that ergot-contaminated grain at Neolithic ceremonial feasts may have caused mass hallucinations and seizures, creating multiple simultaneous drowning events at shallow ritual pools. Drowning in knee-deep water is hard to dignify, but the final entry on this list involves a motive even harder to dignify, because the dispute was over a fish. Number 10. The person who died fighting over a fish. Research at Mesolithic Danube sites Lipensky Vir, Vlesak, Padina, and Hajdučka Vodenica found evidence of sporadic interpersonal violence among hunter-fisher-gatherers. The study population totaled 418 individuals. Violent interactions were sporadic episodes, not endemic warfare. Lipensky Vir along the Danube in Serbia is one of the most sophisticated Mesolithic fishing cultures in Europe. It dates to roughly 6500 to 5500 BCE. The site features trapezoidal stone structures built facing the river with elaborate fish-human hybrid sculptures. Deep spiritual significance of fishing. Fish isotope signatures show aquatic resources comprise 50 to 80% of the diet. Fish was everything, not a side dish. Resource competition, control of fishing stretches, water holes, prey migration routes is among the most basic and ancient motives for violence. In the Netherlands, 3 late Mesolithic and Middle Neolithic sites showed violence affecting males whose burial differed from normal ritual. Violent deaths carried social stigma. Weapons included stone-tipped spears, bone harpoons, and flint arrows. Multi-purpose implements for both fishing and interpersonal violence. Bone harpoons, barbed points designed to catch and hold fish, would cause devastating, difficult-to-extract wounds in human tissue. Far worse than smooth-tipped projectiles. Fishing territories and river environments are inherently contestable. Prime spots, confluences, rapids, shallow spawning areas are geographically fixed. Permanent flashpoints, ethnographic parallels from Pacific Northwest fishing cultures document lethal conflicts over salmon fishing rights. Fish violence is well attested, not hypothetical. Mediterranean Iberian rock art includes scenes hard to read as anything but combat. Groups of archers facing off with pursuit, encirclement, and volleys. The mainstream theory reads sporadic interpersonal violence at fishing sites as resource competition over fixed, geographically contestable fishing territories. Some archaeologists note that different burial treatment for violence victims suggests communities distinguish between honorable and dishonorable death. Fish disputes may have been considered shameful. The speculative reading connects the fish-human hybrid sculptures at Lipensky Vir to sacred spiritual status. Violence over fishing may have had a religious dimension beyond simple resource competition. You lived by the river, you ate from the river, you died by the river, over a fish. All 10 deaths share a common architecture. The victim was killed by something humans themselves invented or built. Trap pits, surgery, architecture, communal hunts, fermented beverages, fishing territories. The pattern of mortality by ingenuity represents a uniquely human category of death. No other species builds lethal infrastructure and then falls victim to it with such regularity. The archaeological record is inherently biased toward recoverable skeletal remains. The true scale of accidental self-inflicted death is unknowable. Taphonomic filters mean soft tissue causes of death, pancreatitis, refeeding syndrome, drowning, are archaeologically invisible. Only bone trauma survives. The 5 to 10% trepanation rate among Neolithic cranial remains suggests medical intervention was far more common than combat injury at many sites. Construction-related deaths from menhirs and mammoth bone huts represent an occupational hazard category that persists unchanged into the modern era. Friendly fire deaths during communal hunts parallel modern military blue-on-blue incidents. Coordination failures in high-stress group activities. The feast death phenomenon has no modern parallel in scale. No contemporary human population faces the feast or famine cycle that made gorging biologically compulsory. Cave art deaths represent the only category where the motivation was purely cultural rather than subsistence related. People died for art, not food. Each death type corresponds to a cognitive leap. Planning produced traps. Medicine produced trepanation. Engineering produced megaliths. Surplus management produced feasting. Symbolic thought produced cave art. The embarrassment factor is a modern projection. These individuals were engaging in activities their communities considered essential, brave, or sacred. Archaeological evidence of care for the injured, like Shanidar 1, shows compassion coexisted with the recklessness. The persistence of dangerous behaviors across millennia, 200,000 years of close-range horse hunting, argues against ignorance. It argues for accepted risk. Trepanation persisted for over 8,000 years across nearly every continent, the longest surviving surgical procedure in human history despite killing a significant fraction of patients. Pit traps remained in use for at least 10,000 years, the simplest and most lethal hunting technology ever devised. Megalith construction spanned 3,000 years across Europe with roughly 35,000 structures erected. Desert kite construction continued from the late Neolithic through the Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 to 2,000 BCE. A 3,000-year engineering tradition. Mammoth bone architecture was maintained for up to 429 years at a single site. Multi-generational commitment to an unstable building technology. Microlith composite weapons were the dominant projectile technology across the entire Mesolithic. 5,000 years of use. Iron Age trepanation achieved 78% survival rates compared to Neolithic 40%. The technology improved but was never abandoned during its failure phase. The cow trepanned at Champ Durand suggests formalized training protocols developed to improve outcomes. Experimental archaeology shows that each of these technologies required significant skill and transmitted knowledge. They were not obvious inventions. The persistence of dangerous technologies argues that prehistoric communities performed cost-benefit analyses and accepted the mortality rate. No technology on this list was abandoned because it was dangerous. Everyone was abandoned, if at all, because better alternatives emerged. Desert kite blueprints engraved in stone represent the earliest known technical documentation. The technology was worth documenting. The caloric return on pit traps and communal hunts vastly exceeded individual hunting. The math justified the deaths. Trepanation rondelles, worn as amulets, show the technology acquired cultural meaning beyond its medical function. The concept of remote capture through traps is considered evidence of complex cognition, making self-entrapment doubly ironic. Technologies that kill their operators but serve the group tend to persist. Technologies that kill their operators without group benefit get abandoned. The durability of these technologies is itself the strongest argument that the deaths, while embarrassing in retrospect, were considered acceptable costs. But there are limits to what the bones can tell us. Drowning leaves no skeletal trauma markers. Every documented case represents a fraction of actual occurrences. Soft tissue causes of death are completely invisible in the archaeological record. The distinction between hunting accident and deliberate attack is often impossible to determine from skeletal evidence alone. Flesh wounds from microliths leave no skeletal trace. Embedded bone points are literally described as the tip of the iceberg. Votive deposition of remains in watery contexts complicates distinguishing sacrifice, accidental death, and punishment. Different burial treatment for violence victims at Dutch Mesolithic sites suggests communities themselves categorize deaths differently. But we cannot recover those categories. Taphonomic analysis at feast sites showing human and animal remains intermingled could represent death during feasting or ritual deposition. The interpretation is contested. Collapsed mammoth bone structures could represent gradual abandonment, deliberate demolition, or catastrophic failure. The bones alone do not distinguish these. Incomplete trepanations could indicate death during surgery or patients waking up. Two completely opposite narratives from identical evidence. The rodeo versus golf cart. Statistical match for Neanderthal injuries shows how comparative datasets can yield contradictory conclusions from the same skeletal data. Perimortem versus postmortem bone damage is notoriously difficult to distinguish. Some apparent violence may be taphonomic artifact. Every interpretation in this list carries the caveat that we are reading modern narratives onto fragmentary evidence. We know how these people died far more reliably than we know why they were in the position to die that way. And that makes the modern parallels all the more striking. Modern construction fatalities from falling objects directly parallel Menhir and Mammoth hut collapses. OSHA exists because humans still die the same ways. Surgical mortality rates for experimental procedures echo Neolithic trepanation. Early adopters of any medical technology face the same risk curve. Roughly 4,000 annual drownings in the United States, 25% in shallow non-pool water. The ritual pool death is a living statistical category. Modern caving fatalities from entrapment in narrow passages occur regularly, even with professional equipment. Military-friendly fire incidents account for 2 to 15% of combat casualties in modern wars. The communal rabbit hunt problem scaled up. Competitive fishing disputes resulting in violence are documented in modern law enforcement records. The Danube fish fight never ended. Extreme eating competitions cause deaths annually from aspiration, gastric rupture, and cardiac events. The feast death reimagined. Rodeo injuries remain among the highest per capita injury rates in professional sports. Neanderthal level risk voluntarily assumed. Modern pitfall accidents, open manholes, construction trenches, sinkholes kill hundreds annually. The trap pit death modernized. Medical errors remain the third leading cause of death in the United States. Trepanation outcomes at scale. The persistence of these death categories across more than 10,000 years suggests they represent irreducible hazards of human activity rather than primitive ignorance. Every prehistoric death type has a modern regulatory framework designed to prevent it. Evidence that the problem was never solved, only managed. The key difference is that modern victims have warning labels, safety equipment, and emergency services. Prehistoric victims had none, which makes their survival rates more impressive, not less. Every death in this list involves a fundamental physical law. Gravity killed in pits, from menhirs, and in caves. Structural mechanics killed in bone huts and on scaffolding. Thermodynamics killed through hypothermia and decomposition. Biology killed through metabolism, infection, and the drowning reflex. Innovation is the process of learning to exploit these laws, and occasionally being killed by them during the learning curve. The trap pit exploits gravity, trepanation exploits cranial pressure mechanics, the megalith exploits leverage. Each is an applied physics problem. The deaths occur not from ignorance of the laws, but from miscalculation within understood systems. The builders knew the risks. Prehistoric humans were not primitive. They were the first engineers, surgeons, architects, and organized hunters, operating without safety nets. The 8,000-year persistence of trepanation and the 10,000-year persistence of pit traps proved the mortality cost was worth the benefit. Compassion coexisted with recklessness. Shanidar 1 was cared for despite catastrophic injury. Naya was mourned by a community that could not save her. These deaths are embarrassing only in retrospect. In context, they represent the cost of being the first species to engineer its own environment. The cave painter who got stuck in the Neanderthal, kicked by a horse shares something essential. They were doing something they believed was worth dying for. Every modern safety regulation, hard hat, surgical protocol, and building code descends from these deaths. The lessons were written in bone. The archaeological record preserves not stupidity but ambition. The willingness to attempt what had never been done. Humans did not become the dominant species by being careful. They became dominant by building traps, performing surgery, erecting monuments, and painting in the dark. The fundamental laws of nature are neutral. They enable the megalith and crush the builder with equal indifference. The gap between what prehistoric humans attempted and what they could safely control is the same gap every innovator occupies today. These 10 deaths are not failures. They are the overhead cost of a species that refused to stop experimenting. The people who died in these ways are the reason we exist. Their innovations fed, sheltered, healed, and inspired the lineages that survived. Innovation has always carried the same price. The question was never whether people would die. It was whether enough would survive to keep building. They did. And we are still falling into our own traps.